The saw screamed its last high note and then fell quiet, leaving only the shuddering groan of the giant pine. Jorah Tame stepped back, pulling the sweat rag from his neck to wipe a brow already slick again in the humid shade of the widow grove. He was a man made of timber and quiet grievances, and the forest had always paid him in both. The tree was an elder, one of the silent kings the town respectfully called a widowmaker, big enough to build a church or crush a man without a sound. It leaned for a moment against the sky, a final defiant posture, and then surrendered. The crash was a god's own sigh, a sound that shook the pine needles from neighboring branches and rattled the teeth in Jorah's jaw. He waited for the echo to die, for the forest to settle back into its uneasy truce. He was a logger, and this was the sound of his bread. But something was wrong. The fall had ended not with the clean, splintering crack of a trunk shattering on the forest floor, but with a dull, resonant thud, a muffled sound like a drum packed with wet earth. It was a soft sound, a wrong sound. He approached with the caution of a man who knew the forest gave no second chances. Sawdust clung to his sweat-dampened shirt, the smell of fresh pine resin sharp and clean in the air. But another scent was rising from the fallen giant, something cloying and ancient, like rot, but not quite. It was the smell of a sealed room, of air that hadn't moved in a century. The trunk had split near the base, a jagged wound several feet long. It wasn't a clean break. The wood had splintered inward, revealing a cavity. Hollow. He cursed under his breath. A hollow elder was a logger's mockery, all grandeur and no profit, days of work for a shell. He kicked at a shard of bark, the frustration a familiar hot taste in his mouth. But it was the nature of the hollow that held him. It wasn't the familiar web-choked darkness of decay. The inner walls were smooth, polished by time into a surface like dark, swirled amber. And from within that impossible smoothness, something had spilled out. Not pulp, not insects, but a tangle of what looked like human hair, matted and stiff with what he first thought was sap. His heart, a steady, reliable muscle, gave a painful lurch. He knelt, his calloused hands hovering over the opening. The smell was stronger here, not of death, but of sleep. A deep, breathless sleep. He peered into the fissure. The world inside the tree was a tight, curved dark, and nestled within it was a shape. He saw the pale curve of a cheek, the closed shell of an eyelid, the line of a slender shoulder. It was a girl. He scrambled back, his breath catching in his throat, a raw, ragged sound. He'd seen death in the woods before, trappers caught in their own snares, loggers who'd misjudged a fall. It was a brutal, honest thing. This was not that. This was sacrilege. She was curled tight as a winter seed, her limbs folded into the narrow space as if she had grown there. Her skin was the color of bleached bone, almost translucent, and it seemed to carry the faint, whorled pattern of the wood that had encased her. Her hair, long and dark, was webbed with hardened sap that held it fast to the polished insides of her tomb, each strand a filament connecting her to the tree. She wore a simple, homespun dress, the fabric so worn it was nearly the same pale color as her skin, its hem frayed into the dirt and wood pulp around her. Her hands were not empty. They were clasped together over her chest, tight and white-knuckled, and clutched between them was a small, flat plank of wood. Jorah stared, his mind refusing to assemble the pieces into a coherent thought. This was the Widow Grove, a place of stories, a place where you didn't fell a tree without asking permission of its shadow, where men claimed some trunks would scream when the axe bit in. He'd always dismissed it as campfire talk, the nervous chatter of men who spent too long in the deep green silence. But the silence now was different. It was heavy, expectant. He reached out a trembling hand, the one that could guide a saw through a trunk thick as a wagon, and touched her shoulder. Her skin was not the cold, waxy texture of a corpse. It was cool, yes, but pliable, like old leather or the underside of a mushroom. A shudder, not of her body, but of the air itself, seemed to pass through the clearing. He pulled his hand back as if burned. He had to get her out. The thought was a clear, sharp command that cut through the fog of his shock. Leaving her here felt like a sin beyond measure. With the head of his axe, he began to pry at the edges of the crack, working carefully, his usual brute force replaced by a surgeon's delicacy. The wood groaned, resisting him. It felt less like breaking lumber and more like cracking a rib cage. With each pry, more of her came into view. The sharp angle of a knee, the small bare feet, their soles darker than the rest of her, tough and calloused in patterns that didn't look like they'd been made by walking on earth. They looked like bark. Finally, a large section of the trunk gave way, falling aside with a soft thud. The light spilled fully onto her, and Jorah saw her face clearly for the first time. She was young, perhaps 12 or 13 years old, her features fine and still. Her eyes were shut, the lashes dark against the impossible pallor of her skin. There was no sign of violence, no blood save for the clear, sticky resin that beaded on her hair and along the seams of her dress. She was a perfect, pristine thing, preserved in amber like an ancient fly. He worked his fingers under her, breaking the delicate tethers of sap-stiffened hair that bound her to the wood. He lifted her. She was lighter than he expected, as if her bones were hollow like a bird's. As he drew her out into the dappled sunlight, her head lolled back, and a sigh, a tiny, almost inaudible puff of air, escaped her lips. Jorah froze, his entire body rigid. It was the sound of breath. Stale, unused air, but breath nonetheless. He held her, a strange and terrible cradle in his arms, and stared down at the face that was no longer a death mask, but simply a mask. Her eyelids fluttered, a tremor so faint he thought he'd imagined it. The plank of wood was still locked in her grip, and now he could see that its surface was not smooth. It was carved, a single name, gouged into the wood with something rough, like a nail. The letters were deep, filled with the dark dust of years. He didn't read it. He didn't dare. The name felt like the core of the mystery, a secret he had no right to know. He held the living ghost of the Widow Grove and felt a fear colder and deeper than any he had ever known. The forest watched him, its silence no longer a peaceful absence of sound, but a held breath. He had not just felled a tree, he had cut open a heart, and now its secret was bleeding out into the ordinary light of day. He carried her out of the forest. It was a long walk back to the settlement, and every step was a torment. He tried to hold her in a way that seemed respectful, but there was no right way to carry a girl who had been sleeping inside a tree. Her body was stiff, yet not with rigor mortis. It was a strange, posed stiffness, her limbs seemingly locked in the position they had held for who knew how long. Her head rested against his shoulder, her sap-stiffened hair scratching his neck like thorns. The smell of her was all over him now, that scent of deep earth and sealed time, and it clung to his clothes and his skin, a perfume of the impossible. He didn't look at her face. He kept his eyes on the narrow, winding path, on the familiar roots and stones, trying to anchor himself in the world he had known before the saw bit into that soft, wrong place. But the world had changed. The very air felt different, thinner. The familiar bird calls sounded like warnings. He was a trespasser, carrying stolen property. When he reached the edge of the woods, where the dense canopy gave way to the open, unforgiving sky of the valley, he hesitated. The settlement was a cluster of gray, weathered buildings huddled by a creek, a place of pragmatic people who measured their lives in cords of wood and inches of rain. How could he walk into that world holding this? He felt the weight of her, not just in his arms, but in his soul. She was a question with no answer, and he was the one who had unearthed it. He adjusted her weight, his muscles aching with a strain that was more than physical. He could feel the stairs already, though the town was still a quarter-mile distant. News traveled on the wind here, in the shift of a curtain, in the sudden quiet of a dog that stopped barking. He walked down the dusty main street, and it was just as he'd imagined. A silence fell. The blacksmith's hammer stopped its ringing clang. A woman gathering laundry from a line froze, a wooden clothespin in her hand, her mouth slightly agape. Men sitting on the porch of the general store lowered their mugs, their eyes fixed on the bundle in his arms. They didn't see a girl. They saw an omen. Jorah's own home, a small, sturdy cabin he had built himself at the edge of town, felt a world away. He walked on, his gaze locked forward, the dust rising in soft puffs around his boots. He felt like a pariah, a leper ringing a silent bell. He had brought the uncanny out of the Widow Grove, a place they all feared and revered in equal measure, and laid it bare under the harsh afternoon sun. Sheriff Brody met him on his porch, a man whose face was a roadmap of compromises and small, necessary cruelties. Brody's eyes took in the sight, Jorah disheveled and wild-eyed, and the pale, still form in his arms, and his expression hardened. "Jorah!"
"What in God's name?" "She was in a tree," Jorah said, his voice a dry rasp. The words sounded insane as soon as they left his mouth. "A hollow pine. I was cutting it down." Brody stepped closer, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol, a habit he fell into when faced with things he couldn't immediately understand or intimidate. He peered at the girl's face. "Is she dead?" "No," Jorah said, the word tasting of miracle and terror. "She's breathing." The sheriff reached out and touched her cheek with the back of his fingers. He flinched, not from cold, but from the texture, the unnatural smoothness. "Lord have mercy." He looked from the girl to Jorah, and his eyes were filled with a suspicion that went deeper than the law. "Where did you say you found her?" "The North Ridge, the Big Elder, the one they call the Widowmaker." A flicker of something, fear, recognition, passed through Brody's eyes. He knew the tree. Everyone did. It was a landmark, a point of reference for stories best left untold. "You had no business cutting that one, Jorah. You know the town's agreement." "It was on the company's lease line," Jorah said, though the excuse felt flimsy and hollow now. "I needed the timber. And you found her instead." Brody's gaze fell to the wooden plank clutched in her hands. "What's that she's holding?" "I don't know," Jorah lied. He did not want to share the name. Not yet. It felt like the girl's only possession, the only piece of her story that belonged to her, and to give it to Brody would be a violation. He pushed past the sheriff and carried her inside his cabin. The small room was filled with the scent of pine and old smoke, the scent of his solitary life. He laid her gently on his own narrow cot, a piece of furniture that had never known the weight of anyone but himself. In the dim light of the cabin, she seemed even more ethereal, a creature of moonlight and wood grain. Her chest rose and fell in a rhythm so shallow it was almost imperceptible. Her eyes remained shut. He stood over her, a large, clumsy man in a small room with an impossible guest. He was a logger. His job was to turn the forest into lumber, to impose order on the wild green chaos. But he had broken a different kind of order today, a deeper one, and he had the terrifying feeling that it could never be put back together. The silence in the cabin was absolute, but for Jorah, it was filled with the memory of a saw blade hitting something soft, a sound that would echo in his heart for the rest of his days. He watched her for hours. The sun bled out of the sky, and the cabin filled with the deep blue of twilight. He didn't light a lamp. He was afraid of what the stark, yellow light might reveal in the corners of her closed eyes, in the strange, root-like scars that he could now see tracing faint patterns on her forearms. He sat in his chair, the wood creaking under his weight, and simply watched her breathe. It was the only proof he had that she was real, that he hadn't been driven mad by solitude and the whispering pines of the Widow Grove. The town left him alone. No one came to offer help or ask questions. They had seen him carry the omen into his home, and they had drawn their curtains and bolted their doors against it. He was quarantined with his discovery. Sometime in the deepest part of the night, when the moon cast long, skeletal shadows across the floor, a change occurred. Her fingers, which had been clenched around the wooden plank in a grip that seemed stronger than life, began to relax. Slowly, one by one, they uncurled. The movement was so gradual, it was like watching a flower wilt in reverse. Finally, her hands fell open at her sides, and the plank lay loose on her stomach. Jorah leaned forward, his heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. He could see the name clearly now, in a stray shaft of moonlight. The letters were crudely carved, but unmistakable. Elara. He whispered it. Elara. The sound of the name in the silent room was a physical thing. It hung in the air, heavy and strange. And on the cot, the girl reacted. It was not a big movement. Her eyelids, which had been perfectly still, fluttered violently for a second. A frantic, trapped bird motion. A single clear tear welled from the corner of her right eye and traced a slow, glistening path down her temple, carving a clean line through the dust and grime on her skin. It was not a tear of sadness. It was a tear of release, as if the speaking of the name had unlocked something deep within her. She did not wake, but in that moment, Jorah knew he had crossed another line. He had spoken the name. He had given voice to the secret she clutched, and now he was bound to it, to her, in a way he could not yet comprehend. He picked up the plank. The wood was old, weathered, but the carved letters felt fresh, the edges still sharp beneath his thumb. Elara. Who was she? And who was the girl sleeping in his bed? The girl who wept in her sleep at the sound of a name she had carried out of the heart of a tree. He looked from the plank to the girl, and a terrible thought began to form in his mind, a thought so monstrous and contrary to the laws of nature that he tried to push it away. He looked at the girl's face, at the fine, pale features, and then back at the name. This girl was not Elara. This girl was holding Alara's name. So where in all of God's green and terrible earth was Elara? The days that followed were a waking dream. The girl did not wake, but she was not in a coma. It was a state of profound, unnatural slumber. Jorah had to care for her like an infant. He cleaned her, a task that filled him with a clumsy paternal shame. He washed the grime from her skin, and it was then he saw the full extent of the marks on her body. Faint, silvery scars that branched across her back and legs like root systems. The calluses on her feet and hands were thick and hard, patterned like the bark of an old pine. Her hair, once he painstakingly worked the sap out with warm water and oil, was a river of night, but it remained stiff, as if each strand held a memory of its woody confinement. He tried to give her water, tipping a spoon against her lips. A little of it would trickle into her mouth, and she would swallow, a purely reflexive action, but she took no sustenance. She was living on something else. The air, perhaps, or the memory of the name he kept safe on his mantelpiece. He tried to find the story behind the name. He went to the general store, his first venture back into the town's society. The silence that greeted him was thick and hostile. Men who had shared a drink with him last week now stared into their mugs, their shoulders hunched against him. Martha, the store owner's wife, served him without meeting his eye, her hands trembling as she counted his change. "Martha," he said, his voice low. "The name Elara. Do you know it?" She flinched as if he'd slapped her. She looked around, her eyes wide with fear, and shook her head, a quick, jerky motion. "Don't know no one by that name." It was a lie, and they both knew it. Her fear was too potent to be ignorance. He tried the blacksmith, a man of sweat and iron, a man he thought was too practical for superstition. "Elara," Jorah said, standing by the heat of the forge. The blacksmith spat into the coals, a sizzle of defiance. "Some names are best left buried, Jorah. You dug up something you should have left in the ground. Now it's your burden to carry." The words followed him back to his cabin. A burden. That's what she was to them. Not a child, not a miracle, but a curse he had unleashed. His solitude, once a choice, was now a sentence. He and the girl were an island, and the rest of the town was the sea, slowly eroding their shores. He found his answer, or the beginning of it, in the church records. The church was empty, dust motes dancing in the slanted light from the stained glass windows. Reverend Michael was old, his hands palsied, his memory a tattered ledger of the town's sins and sorrows. Ilara, the Reverend murmured, his finger tracing a line in the baptismal records book. Ah, yes, I remember. Not the girl, but the name. A sad story. A tragedy. He told Jorah a fragmented tale. 2 sisters, Ilara and Lyra. Ilara, the elder by a year, was wild, a creature of the woods. Lyra was her shadow, quiet and frail. Their parents were newcomers, people who didn't understand the rules of the valley, the unspoken pact with the Widow Grove. 10 years ago, maybe 12, the sisters had gone into the woods to pick berries. They never came back. The town searched for weeks. They found a single dropped basket of crushed blueberries. Nothing more. The forest had swallowed them whole. The parents, broken by grief, had left the valley a year later, unable to bear the sight of the trees that had taken their children. Ilara was the bold one, the Reverend said, his voice a dry whisper. Lyra, she wouldn't have lasted a day without her sister. Jorah's blood ran cold. He looked at the records. Ilara Taryn, baptized 1870. Lyra Taryn, baptized 1871. Lyra. A name that felt like a whisper of the one carved on the plank. He went back to his cabin, his mind reeling. He stood over the sleeping girl. Lyra? He whispered, trying the name out in the silent room. Her reaction was more profound than before. A shudder racked her thin frame. Her lips parted, and a low, guttural moan escaped, a sound of such deep and ancient pain that it made the hairs on Jorah's arms stand on end. It was the sound of a name being torn from a place it had been buried for a decade. She didn't wake, but he knew. The girl in his bed was Lyra, and she had been clutching her sister's name, her protector's name, for 10 years in the dark heart of a tree. The knowledge changed everything. He was no longer caring for a nameless phantom. He was caring for Lyra, the lost girl, the one who had survived. But how? The question was a constant, tormenting presence. How could a child survive for a decade inside a tree? What had she eaten? What had she breathed? The rational part of his mind, the part that knew the mechanics of saws and the properties of wood, screamed that it was impossible. But the evidence was there, sleeping on his cot, her breath a faint mist in the cool air. The folklore he had always dismissed came creeping back, tales of forest spirits, of children stolen and replaced by changelings made of bark and shadow. He looked at Lyra's strange, root-like scars and wondered if he was caring for a girl at all, or something the forest had made in her image. One evening, a storm rolled in, the sky turning a bruised purple. Thunder cracked overhead, and rain lashed against the windows of the cabin. Jorah was sitting by the fire, watching the flames, the carved plank with Ilara's name resting on his lap. He ran his thumb over the letters, feeling the desperate strength of the hand that had carved them. Suddenly, a sound from the cot made him turn. Lyra was sitting up. Her eyes were wide open. Jorah's breath hitched. He had waited for this moment for weeks, imagined it 1,000 times, but he was not prepared for the reality. Her eyes were not the eyes of a child. They were ancient, dark, and empty, like knots in an old piece of wood. They did not seem to see him. They were fixed on the window, on the storm raging outside. Her face was a mask of placid stillness. She was awake, but not present. Lyra, he said softly, his voice trembling. She didn't respond. She simply stared at the window, her gaze unwavering. He moved closer, slowly, as if approaching a wild animal. He knelt by the cot. He could see his own reflection in her dark, vacant eyes, a small, distorted image of a frightened man. "It's all right," he said, the words feeling foolish and inadequate. "You're safe here." She turned her head, the movement slow and deliberate, and her eyes met his. For a second, he felt a spark of connection, a flicker of a soul trapped deep within, but then it was gone, and her eyes were just empty mirrors again. She raised a hand and pointed a slender finger towards the mantelpiece. Not at the plank with Ilara's name, but at his logging axe, which rested beside it. Her finger was steady, her expression unchanging. It wasn't a request. It was a command. A silent, terrifying command. He didn't know what she wanted with it, and a cold dread washed over him. He stayed where he was, kneeling on the floor, caught in the grip of her silent, soulless gaze. The storm raged on, and inside the small cabin, a different kind of storm was beginning to break. She did not speak. In the days that followed her awakening, she remained utterly mute. But she was no longer still. She moved about the cabin with a slow, deliberate grace, her bare feet making no sound on the wooden floorboards. Her movements were ritualistic. She would trace patterns in the dust on the floor with her finger, always the same shape, a figure 8, the symbol of infinity, drawn over and over. She would stand by the window for hours, staring out at the edge of the widow grove, her body as still as the trees she watched. She would not eat the food Jorah offered, salt pork, beans, bread. He left them for her, but they remained untouched. One morning, he found her eating a handful of pine needles she had gathered from the porch, chewing them slowly, her expression placid. He saw her licking the sap that oozed from the firewood stacked by the hearth. She was still a creature of the forest, and the world of men was a foreign land whose nourishment she could not accept. Her silence was a living thing in the cabin. It was not the absence of noise, it was a presence, a weight that pressed down on Jorah, making it hard to breathe. He found himself talking to her constantly, a desperate, one-sided conversation. He told her about his day, about the weather, about the grain of the wood he was carving. He was trying to fill the void, to draw her back into the world of human sound. But his words fell into the chasm of her silence and vanished. Her dark, empty eyes would follow him, but they gave no sign of comprehension. It was like living with a ghost, a body animated by some force he could not name. The town's fear curdled into something uglier. Hostility. One day he found a dead raven on his doorstep, its neck broken, a clear and brutal warning. The word witch was scratched into his door, the letters crude and angry. Jorah's fear for Lyra began to be overshadowed by a fierce, protective anger. She was not a witch. She was a victim. She was a child who had suffered something beyond imagination. He began to carry his axe with him when he went into the settlement, not for logging, but for protection. The weight of it in his hand was a grim comfort. He knew he had to understand what had happened to her, to them in the forest. The Reverend's story was not enough. It was the official account, the neat and tidy version of a tragedy. The truth, he suspected, was messier, buried deeper. His investigation led him to the one person in town who might know more, the one person more ostracized than he was, old Mother Hemlock. She lived in a dilapidated shack up the creek, a woman who served as the town's midwife, healer, and keeper of secrets. She was a creature of the old ways, a woman who understood the language of herbs and omens, and the townspeople sought her out in the dead of night for remedies they would deny needing in the light of day. He found her tending a garden of gnarled, strange-looking plants. She was ancient, her face a web of wrinkles, her eyes as bright and sharp as a bird's. She looked up as he approached, and she was not afraid. "I knew you'd come," she said, her voice like the rustle of dry leaves. "You carry the scent of that tree on you." He stood before her, the carved plank with Alara's name in his hand. He held it out to her. "Tell me what you know." She took the plank, her gnarled fingers tracing the letters. A look of profound sadness crossed her face. "Ah, Alara, the firefly, and Lyra, the moth. You couldn't have one without the other." She led him inside her shack, which was filled with the pungent smell of drying herbs and wood smoke. She told him the story the Reverend had left out. The Terran parents were not just newcomers, they were zealots. The father was a fire and brimstone preacher from the east, a man who saw the devil in every shadow and every whispering leaf. He believed the Widow Grove was a place of evil, a pagan temple that needed to be cleansed. He forbade his daughters from entering it, telling them stories of demons and lost souls. But Ilara, she was the forest's child, Mother Hemlock said. She didn't see evil. She saw magic. She would sneak away, and little Lyra would always follow, terrified of the woods, but more terrified of being left behind. The day they disappeared, the father had beaten Alara for sneaking into the woods. He had locked her in the root cellar, but Lyra, quiet, timid Lyra, had slipped the bolt. The two sisters had fled together, not to pick berries, but to escape. They ran into the one place they knew their father would not follow, the Widow Grove. The father! He told the town they were lost, Mother Hemlock whispered, her eyes dark with memory. He never told them he had driven them out. He let his pride bury his grief. And the town? It was easier to believe the forest had taken them than to believe a father could do such a thing. The story settled in Jorah's heart like a stone. It was not a tale of monsters and spirits. It was a tale of ordinary human cruelty, of a fear that had festered into a tragedy. He looked at the old woman. But how did she survive? In the tree? Mother Hemlock shook her head slowly. There are things in the Widow Grove older than any church, older than any god a man can write down in a book. The forest protects its own. When Alara knew they were lost and freezing, when she knew Lyra was fading, she must have found one of the old places, a cradle tree. She put her sister inside, to keep her warm. She must have carved her own name on that plank, a promise to come back for her. Her voice broke, but she never did. The image was so clear, so painfully vivid, that Jorah had to close his eyes. Alara, the brave one, sacrificing herself to save her shadow, placing her sister in the warm, dark heart of the tree, a desperate act of love and hope. And then what? What had become of Alara? The tree. It kept her, Mother Hemlock continued, as if reading his thoughts. It fed her. It shared its own slow life with her. It put her to sleep, to wait. It wrapped her in its own skin and dreamed for her. She is not just a girl anymore, Jorah. She is part of the woods now. The part of her that was Lyra is buried deep, deep down. What you have in your cabin is the vessel, the memory. He went back to the cabin, the old woman's words echoing in his mind. A cradle tree, the vessel. He looked at Lyra, who was standing by the window, her back to him, staring at the forest. He saw her not as a burden or a curse, but as a survivor of a horror he could barely comprehend. He saw her as a testament to her sister's love. He went to the mantelpiece, picked up the logging axe, and walked towards her. Her name was Lyra, but her story was Alara's. He had to take her back to where it all began. He didn't have to lead her. The moment he stepped onto the porch, axe in hand, she turned from the window and followed him. She seemed to know where they were going. She walked behind him, her bare feet making no sound on the trail, her dark eyes fixed on his back. The town watched them go. He saw faces in windows, figures standing in the shadows of doorways. He felt their collective gaze, a mixture of fear and condemnation. They were letting him go, letting him take the bad omen back to where it belonged. It was an expulsion. The walk to the North Ridge was long and arduous, but Lyra never tired. She moved with an eerie, tireless grace, her breath even and steady. Jorah, however, felt the weight of every step. He was walking back into his own transgression, back to the scene of the crime. When they reached the clearing, it was just as he had left it. The great, hollowed-out trunk of the Widowmaker lay on the ground, a fallen giant, and in the center of the clearing stood the stump. Lyra walked past him, her eyes never leaving the stump. She approached it with a reverence that made Jorah's skin crawl. It was not just a piece of dead wood to her. It was an altar. It was home. She reached out and placed her hand on its flat, ringed surface, and then she began to walk. She circled the stump, her steps slow and measured. Round and round she went, her bare feet tracing a path in the soft earth. Jorah watched, his heart pounding. She was performing a ritual, a ceremony he did not understand. He looked down at the path she was making. It was a perfect circle, but she did not stop. She continued her slow, hypnotic walk, and her path began to cross over itself, weaving in and out, until the shape she was tracing in the dirt was no longer a circle, but a figure 8, an infinity loop, with the stump as its center, the same symbol she had traced in the dust on his cabin floor. The air in the clearing grew thick, heavy. The silence of the forest deepened, becoming a pressure against his eardrums. A wind began to stir, rustling the leaves of the surrounding trees, though the air on Jorah's face was still. The sound was like whispers, 1,000 voices speaking at once, a language he could not understand, but whose meaning he felt in his bones. It was a language of grief, of memory, of time itself. Lyra continued her endless walk, her face impassive, her eyes fixed on something he could not see. She was no longer just a girl. She was a priestess, a conduit for the power that resided in that clearing, in that stump. Jorah felt a presence behind him. He turned, his hand tightening on the handle of the axe. It was Sheriff Brody, his face pale and sweating, despite the coolness of the air. But he was not alone. Behind him stood a handful of men from the town, the blacksmith, the store owner, a few other loggers. They carried rifles, but they held them loosely, not like hunters, but like frightened children clutching talismans. "What is she doing?" Brody demanded, his voice strained. "Remembering," Jorah said, his own voice sounding distant to his ears. "This is unholy," the blacksmith muttered, his eyes wide with terror as he watched Lyra's unending silent ritual. "It's witchcraft." "No," Jorah said, turning to face them, positioning himself between them and the girl. "It's sorrow. You've let it fester for 10 years, and now you have to look at it." His words seemed to strike a nerve. The men shifted uncomfortably. They had all been part of the search party 10 years ago. They had all listened to the father's lies. They had all chosen the easier story, the one that blamed the forest instead of one of their own. Their shared guilt was a palpable thing in the clearing. Suddenly Lyra stopped. She stood perfectly still in the center of the infinity loop she had drawn, her back to the stump, facing them. The whispering wind died down. The forest held its breath. She raised her head, and her eyes, which had been so empty, so vacant, were now filled with a blazing, ferocious light. It was a light of intelligence, of anger, of a pain so profound it was terrifying to behold. She opened her mouth. Jorah braced himself for a scream, a moan, for any of the inhuman sounds he had heard from her before. But what came out was a voice, a clear, strong voice that was not a child's whisper, but a young woman's declaration, a voice that none of them had heard in 10 years, but that some of them would never forget. "He locked the door," she said. The voice was not Lyra's. It was Alara's. The blacksmith gasped, taking a step back. Sheriff Brody's face went ashen. They recognized the voice, the cadence, the fierce, defiant tone. Lyra, or the thing that wore her body, took a step forward. Her eyes were not on Jorah, but on Brody. "I told you," the voice of Alara continued, ringing with a decade of cold fury. "I told you he beat me. I showed you the bruises on my arms, and you told me to obey my father. You told me it was a family matter." Sheriff Brody flinched, as if struck. He remembered. He remembered the fierce, wild-eyed girl who had come to him for help, and he remembered turning her away, siding with the respectable, God-fearing man over the unruly child. The girl's gaze shifted to the blacksmith. "You heard him screaming at us. Your forge is right next to our yard. You heard everything, and you hammered your steel louder to drown out the sound." The blacksmith lowered his head, his big shoulders slumping in shame. The truth of it hung in the air, undeniable. The whole town had been complicit in their silence, in their refusal to see what was right in front of them. They had sacrificed 2 little girls to their own comfort, to the preservation of their fragile peace. Finally, the girl's burning gaze returned to Jorah. The fury in her eyes softened, replaced by an ancient, bottomless sorrow. The voice, Alara's voice, was softer now, a whisper that tore at Jorah's heart. "I told her I would come back," she said. "I promised her, but the cold came so fast.
I carved my name so she wouldn't forget me, so she would wait. The voice broke, turning into a sound that was half sob, half wind. Tell her, tell Lyra I'm sorry. And then the light in her eyes went out. It was as if a switch had been flipped. Her body went slack, her head dropped, and she crumpled to the ground in a heap, falling into the center of the infinity loop she had drawn in the dirt. The vessel was empty. The voice of Alara was gone. Only Lyra remained, unconscious, her purpose served. The clearing was silent, but it was a new kind of silence. It was the silence of judgment, of a truth that could no longer be denied. Brody and the other men did not move. They were frozen, monuments to their own failure. They were no longer afraid of the girl. They were afraid of themselves, of the ghosts they had created. Jorah walked past them, his face set like stone. He knelt and gathered the small, limp form of Lyra into his arms. She was just a girl again, impossibly light, impossibly fragile. He held her close, the scent of the forest and of deep, old time clinging to her. He did not look back at the men. He left them there in the clearing with the stump and the ghost of a voice and the terrible, echoing silence of their own guilt. He walked away from the widow grove, carrying the survivor, the living testament to a love that was stronger than death, and a sorrow that had finally spoken its name. He took her away from that town, away from the valley of whispers and shame. He traveled east, putting miles between them and the forest that had been both her tomb and her cradle. Lyra did not speak again. The voice of Alara was gone forever, her message delivered. Lyra remained in her silent, waking dream, her eyes open but seeing nothing of the world Jorah moved her through. She still ate only what the wild provided, berries he picked for her, the tender shoots of plants he found by the roadside. She was a child of nature, and he had become her keeper, her guardian. He did not try to make her speak. He did not try to draw her back into his world. He accepted her as she was, a sacred, broken thing, a living memorial. He spoke to her sometimes, in a low, quiet voice, telling her stories. Not his stories, but the story of her sister. He told her how brave Alara was, how much she must have loved her to do what she did. He wanted the part of her that was still Lyra, buried deep inside, to hear it, to know she had not been forgotten. They settled, finally, in a quiet, lonely place, a small plot of land with a single sturdy oak tree. He built a new cabin, his hands finding comfort in the familiar work. He cared for her, bathed her, fed her, and sat with her in the long, silent evenings. Her presence was no longer a terror to him. It was a strange kind of peace. She was a constant, silent reminder of the mystery that lay at the heart of the world, a mystery he had touched when his saw blade bit into something soft. He had unearthed a grief, and in doing so, had been given a purpose. One night, he built a large fire in the yard. The flames leaped high into the dark, star-dusted sky. He went into the cabin and came back with the logging saw, the tool of his old life, the instrument that had started it all. He looked at its sharp, clean teeth, the teeth that had cut open the heart of the widowmaker. It was a good saw, a tool that had earned him his living, but it was also a cursed object, a relic of a violation. With a grunt, he hurled it into the center of the fire. The metal glowed red, then white, the wooden handles catching and turning to black, writhing ash. Then he took out the small, carved plank he had carried all this way. The name, Alara. He held it for a long moment, his thumb tracing the letters one last time, a final communion. It was not just a name, it was a promise, a prayer, a testament. It was too sacred to keep on a dusty mantelpiece. It needed a different kind of home. He burned the saw that night and planted her name in fire.